Let's talk about Python data types. So there are different ways to store our variables depending on what we're going to be working with. For example, we can use a string, which is going to be useful for text. Let's see an example. So we can create a variable. Every time you want to define text, a string, you have to put quotation marks. So you can do hello world, for example, like this. And when you print it, you will see hello world. Or you can also define it with one quotation instead of the double quotation marks. For example, you will see Python is great. Both of them will work. You should not have any issues. Then we're going to have numeric types, which is the data type that you're going to be using, especially if you want to do operations. And then we have three different types. We have integers, which are going to be just defined. For example, let's say we want to have a number 5, that's an integer. Or also, you can just do integer 5, and you'll have the integer. We are also gonna do floats for whenever we want to have like decimal points. For example, 5.2, that's gonna be a float. Or you can do float and then 5.2. When you print it, you're gonna see that float. Or we can also have complex numbers, like in here. So you can define, for example, 48. And that's going to be a complex number. So what happens if, for example, I have a float number and I want to convert it to an integer, I can do that. So as you see, before we define c to be 5.2, which is a float, and I want to convert it to an integer, I can do integer c, which we know it's a float. And you will see now it just turns it to 5. We can also turn our integers into floats. For example, float, we know that b equals to 5, so float b, and you can see now it adds a dot zero because it's an integer. So these are the ones that we're going to be using for operations, of course, depending on what you're going to be doing. Then we have the sequence types, where we have lists, tuple, and ranges. So a list, it's going to be defined as, well, using square brackets. So for example, just as we did previously, banana, cherry, and apple. Oh, as you can see, I missed a quotation, so you can just add it, and that's it. And then when you print it here, this is a list. We can also have tuples. The difference is that a tuple, instead of having a square bracket, it's going to have a parenthesis. So you can just change it, for example, in here. So now we have a tuple, and we can also have a range. So our range is going to be a little bit different because we're going to have a set of numbers. So for example, if you define range of 5 and you print it, you're going to see range 0 to 5, which means like it counts from 0 to, remember, 4, because Python starts at 0, so you don't include the last number. So if you want to, for example, for x in f, so for every number in our range that we defined it before, print x. Now we're going to be able to look at each of the numbers inside that range. So as you can see, it starts at 0, then it goes to 1, 2, 3, and finally 4. Okay, so just examples. Then we're going to have the dictionary, which is a mapping type. this one is actually going to be very useful. So let's see an example. Let's say you want to define a dictionary where you want to set the name of a person and their last name. Oh, sorry. And their last name. So to define a dictionary, we're going to use these keys. Then you're going to define the variable that you want to be setting. For example, in this case, we're going to be setting name. And then we're going to define a name. We're going to use my name in this case, Carla. Let's say you also want to define the last name. So you can just do last name. And you can do Paniagua. So if you print it, you can see the dictionary. We're going to look a little bit more into this later on. You can have in this, for example, several names and several last names. And that's very useful if you want to, for example, change the names in the columns or assign colors to a plot according to the variable, etc. This can become very useful later on, we'll see. Then we're also going to have the sets and the frozen set. So to define a set, we're just going to be using the keys again, but as a difference from the dictionary, from before in the dictionary, you have one variable and then you assign a value. In a set, you're not going to be assigning any value to any variable. So you're just going to be assigning, like saving it as if it was a list. Very similar to what we did before, banana, cherry, and apple. But now we have a set. And we can also have a frozen set. So the big difference between a set and a frozen set is that the set can be modified later on. So you define it, and then if you want to add another fruit to your list, you can add it or remove one or change one. You can do all of that. But whenever you have a frozen set, it cannot be modified after you edit it. So that's like the main difference. Okay, so let's say, for example, we want to remove an element from our set. So you're gonna do the name of your set, your variable, dot remove, and then you're gonna select the element that you want to remove. For example, let's say I want to remove apple. So if I print G again, you're gonna see that I don't have apple anymore. But if I define a frozen set, so let's say now we want to define a frozen set. Remember, frozen sets are not supposed to be able to be modified after you create it. So frozen set, and then we can just copy it and paste it. So we're going to be using the same set that we did before. So you can see we have our set, and if I want to remove now apple from my set, you can see an error because it's a frozen set and you cannot remove apple or anything. It doesn't have like the remove option. You cannot modify it anymore. Okay, so that's the main difference between set and frozen set. Then we also have Boolean, which is true or false. This one is also very useful when you're doing a for loop or an if and else, mainly an if and else, because you can do something. For example, if this variable is 1, then blah blah blah, or if this variable is true, then whatever you want to do. So usually the if and the else will interpret a yes as a true and a no as a false. So that one is also very useful. And let's just define it. So we're gonna have true. You can have true or false for the Boolean. Those are the only two options. And then finally, and if you want to define it, you can also do Boolean, for example, 1, it's going to be true, and 0 is going to be false. And then finally, we're going to have the binary types. So you can just define a byte, just like in here. Okay, so we can also define the byte like this. And if you print it, you will see your byte. We can also have a byte array, which is basically just going to be an array of bytes. It's going to be very similar to a range or to an array, and you can have any different values that you want. And finally, you're going to have the memory view, which is going to be pointing to somewhere inside the memory. So these are going to be the main data types that we're going to be working with. Just keep this in mind. There's different ways to define them. For example, just keep in mind that you can go from float to integer to complex. You can be playing with them. Remember that the frozen set cannot be modified after you define it. The Boolean can be true and false or 0 and 1. And then every time you define a string, you need to add quotation marks. If you don't add the quotation marks, Python is going to think that you're talking about a defined variable already. So instead of like, for example, in here saying trying to define the text, it will think that you're using the A, like the name of your variable. So just keep that in mind. You have to use quotation marks, and they can be single or they can be double quotation marks. Okay, thank you for watching. Leave your comments if you have any questions.